So, as is the case, there's a surfeit of things that we could be talking about this week, but I really want to concentrate on
John?
is happening in Gaza. Let me turn down the people in the background. I think we might have a little bit of background noise. So I'm going to mute you, and then, as always, unmute yourself whenever you want. Put something in the chat whenever you want. We're old pros at this, but I do want to be hearing from you. And I would say this very quickly, especially today. And maybe I should start with a few guideposts before I get into this. One thing is I really do want to be in dialogue with you. And so whenever you have a comment, please do let me know. Just unmute yourself, put it in the chat, whatever works best for you. The second thing is that I think I don't really need to say this with this group, but this is a topic on which I know there are passionate and contradictory views, and the right admonition to address each other with mutual respect, I don't think is really necessary. We do that already. We know each other well. But having said that, I want you to think through, and I'm gonna, I guess, say two things here. The first is that when you feel strongly about one side in this conflict, is it not the case that there are other people who feel equally strongly, more or less in the same way, on the other side of the conflict? And that should always be right a cause for pulling back and reflecting a little bit. Yes, I feel strongly about my views, but maybe my views don't have a monopoly on insider truth. And the fact that there are other people whom I generally respect who also feel strongly on the other side, that should lead me maybe to distance myself, pull back a little bit and think about, well, is my perspective the only valid perspective on this? Are there reasons to maybe be taking seriously the other side that include reasons maybe to moderate at least the way in which I'm asserting what I have to say, maybe even my view itself? And then I'll say one more thing, and this is not just for us today. This is for everybody who is a party to this conflict. And I think there is a natural, almost an unavoidable tendency when you find yourself in the middle of or the aftermath of a protracted violent conflict in which both sides have suffered horribly, to look back and to say that was their fault. This is what they did. This is what caused this. And I'm going to say very quickly what I want to discuss today is the 20-point Trump Blair peace plan that has been proposed for Israel, Gaza, the Palestinians. And that if it is going to have any prospects for success, and please note, right, it has, you know, five, six provisions that have to do with the immediate cessation of hostilities, the return of hostages, the resumption of aid to Gaza, preventing further catastrophic famine in the region. That stuff is the most urgent. But it also has 14 other points, which are really, I want to say, about the next quarter century. You know, if this plan is really going to succeed, it is going to take until 2050, I suspect, for it to fully play out. And it is a plan that involves reconciliation between the two peoples, that holds out not only for a Gaza that is demilitarized and so not a threat to Israel, but for a Palestinian state that incorporates Gaza and the West Bank, and then for some kind of two-state solution to one of the most tangled, difficult conflicts in the world today, one of the most combustible. And if there's going to be any prospects for the Israelis and the Palestinians overcoming their 70 plus years of hostilities and being able to live in peace as two neighboring societies, it's going to have to involve a pivot from looking at the past and looking instead at the future. And I do believe that this is what this plan calls for, that in important ways it calls for economic cooperation and integration between Israel, a future Palestinian state in the short term, Gaza and the West Bank, and the rest of the region. And that the model here is the model of the European Union. And by the way, of Shimon Peres from the late 1980s, early 1990s, the model is, right, the hostilities which spread over centuries between Germany and France and England or Britain and Spain and Italy. And we could keep enumerating, right? The players that went to war repeatedly in the continent of Europe, but also perpetual proxy war in their overseas holdings, their imperial enterprises, ceased, right? And at this point, there is the threat from Russia, but the members of the European Union and before that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization seem really to not be very much at risk of going to war with each other anymore. How did they achieve that? Well, they achieved that because they began to have stable, long-term commercial relations with each other. The Baron de Montesquieu, many centuries ago, said commercial relations are a civilizing force. When we stop, right, focusing on each other as our enemies and instead focus on each other as potential commercial partners, someone I might want to sign a contract with to create a lot of profit, that allows us to pull back from these hostilities. Boy, I am sorry. There is a lot of background noise right now. Is it interfering with you hearing me?
No.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, you just sound a little echoey, but it's fine.
Okay, it'll be over in a minute, and
Yeah.
it'll take me longer than that to go get them to stop. And as long as you're hearing me okay, I can't hear anything, right? Barely the sound of my own voice, but I'm glad it's not interfering. So my advice is not only that we decenter our perspectives, that we think about the other side, that we think about the potential reasonableness of alternative views on this, but also that we focus more on the future and the tiny little ray of hope that this peace plan has opened up in the contemplation of a future in which there might be economic integration, two states living side by side, and that even if this strikes us right now as more of a wish or a fantasy than a genuine prospect, let alone a concrete plan, and we'll get into the plan and how vague it is, but that might be an advantage as well as a limitation to this plan, to let the details, right, actually be fleshed out once a little bit more progress has been made in the short term. But all of that to say, it's going to have to be because forward momentum is sustained. And the worst thing you can do for forward momentum in these kinds of conflict situations is always be looking over your shoulder at the past, at who did what when. And in a sense, for reconciliation to succeed, there has to be sustained contact between the two groups that begins by humanizing each other, right? And I will just start out by saying, right, this conflict does not start on October 7th, but on October 7th, the right 2023, Hamas fighters invaded Israel and slaughtered brutally 1,200 people, right, raped, tortured, killed children, women, grandparents, obviously civilians. This was a terrorist attack. And since then, right, for 2 years and 4 days now, the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, but also the civil society of Israel, has focused on the terror of October 7th. And please note, of course, this is a state that was founded in the aftermath of genocide. And so the people of Israel are very, right, sensitive to the idea that another people might have their designs on exterminating their people. It's happened in the recent past, and it was genocidal violence that was done, right? I don't mean in the legal sense of that term, but at least in the sense that it was a clear effort, indiscriminate, to just kill as many Israeli Jews as could be killed at one time. That is exactly what is, right, motivating this terrible campaign in Gaza. And on the other side, for 2 years now, the Israeli Defense Forces have leveled almost every building in the entire territory that 2 million plus people in a very narrow strip of land call their home. And not just that, they have imposed a siege that has resulted in widespread famine and starvation. The casualties, which we don't have a precise figure for, I am quite confident by the time, right, all of the counting is done, the grim business in the aftermath of the ceasefire of trying to exhume people buried under the rubble and give them proper funerals and remembrances. We're going to be well over 100,000 Palestinian casualties, and it won't surprise me at all if 40,000 of them are children, right? And so on both sides, the grievances, the grounds for hostility are going to be so strong. So the work of reconciliation in this context is a mountain to climb. It's a tremendously difficult undertaking. And so I do want to speak to that today. But I also want to notice very quickly that what gets these sides, right, to the negotiating table, successfully negotiating a ceasefire, is not any, right, kind of mutual recognition or reconciliation. It is complete and utter exhaustion. And this is on both sides, right? Hamas has been reduced to a ragtag group of fighters hiding in tunnels underground, not really capable of mounting any kind of effective defense for their territory, mainly concentrating on booby trapping to try to lure the Israelis into dangerous, right, buildings and then blow them up. But having said that, right, the people of Gaza, it's hard to know exactly what they think at the moment. Obviously, you don't conduct polls during periods when the vast majority of the population is internally displaced, homeless, and their entire lives have been reduced to rubble, their entire society razed. But what does seem clear, I'll add very quickly, right? The Israeli Defense Forces have prevented foreign journalists from getting in for the most part. And so the effort to determine what Gazans really think, what the Palestinians really believe at the moment is difficult. But it does appear that there is very good evidence that they are exhausted by this and that they have turned in large numbers against Hamas because Hamas has brought this raining down upon them. And so the idea that Hamas had very little choice, right? Let me add one more factor, and then Anne, I see you've got your hand raised, so I'll come to you. The idea that in the aftermath of 2 years of warfare, in which Gaza has been the primary but not the only theater, Iran is much weaker militarily. Hezbollah is totally degraded, right, militarily. And so Hamas not only is, right, reduced to a ragtag force, has the people of Gaza turning against it due to the tremendous suffering it has provoked, but also, right, cut off from other sources of support and aid. And so it's limping to the negotiating table in a very weak position. And that makes it easy for external forces to extract concessions from it. And I will just say very briefly, exactly the same thing is true of Israel, right? Which is to say, Benjamin Netanyahu's government is on the brink, if it isn't there already, of becoming an international pariah government. Many European and other societies are not just condemning the conduct of the war. The United Nations has found that it is probable that Israel is engaged in genocide, which is a stinging finding for a society that was founded in the aftermath of genocide and on the commitment to not allow genocide to occur again. Obviously, two ways of reading that: genocide to the Jews or genocide in general as a principle. And unless you have that narrow ethnocentric reading, the idea that Israel is credibly alleged to be engaged in genocide. I don't think we want to litigate this today. I think it's tortured and probably counterproductive to really try to flesh out whether this is genocide or not. But just the fact that Israel might be guilty in the strict legal sense of the term of genocide is a tremendous rebuke. And then please note, right, the result of all of these countries, right, condemning Israel is they're unwilling to support this campaign anymore. Only the United States really is the last remaining ally of the Netanyahu government, at least. And when Netanyahu bombed Qatar to try to take out the remainder of Hamas's leadership, when they were there to negotiate or consider the Trump peace plan, really drove a wedge between Netanyahu and Trump. So, all of that to say, both of these parties, both of these societies are exhausted, traumatized, weak, isolated. That's the condition under which the United States can say, following a plan that apparently was worked out primarily by Tony Blair, this is what we want you to do. And the first steps of the plan meet with agreement. But these societies are not going to remain exhausted, isolated, demoralized forever. And as they begin to recover, the temptation is going to be to focus on the past, to focus on the tremendous suffering of the last 2 years and to blame the other side for it. And so the really difficult work is not in the initial phases of this plan, it is in the years ahead and the always hard work of reconciliation. And I know you've got your hand up. Go ahead. What would you like to share?
Yeah, that was a perfect intro to what I had to say. I keep here, on the news and all this, and they're going to be talking and all that's wonderful. But what about Sudan? I mean, the economic world condemned Israel in a way that, again, makes Israel special in this sense. There's nothing in Sudan and where millions have died, and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's really difficult to listen to the superlatives, if you wish, placed against on Israel and on the Gaza thing, which has been terrible. But the world doesn't pay attention to what's going on in the less economically viable places.
And so, and I just you kind of clarified what you're saying at the very end to me. I was wondering if part of what you were saying, and I was listening to a forum on the radio about this the other day, in which there was a woman who's a Zionist, a delegate to the World Zionist Congress, saying, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I completely disagree with that proposition, right? I think you can be critical of the state of Israel in various ways. You can be critical of the Netanyahu government without being an anti-Zionist, right? You can be an anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite. And by the way, some of the people who are anti-Netanyahu are anti-Netanyahu because they're anti-Semites, and some of the people who are anti-Zionists are anti-Zionists because they're anti-Semites. There's
Mhm.
no easy path through these arguments. You got to listen to the details. You got to unpack them. You got to draw clear lines between what is legitimate political disagreement and what is just straight out hate. And when I first heard you speaking, I hear a lot. Well, why is everybody focused on Israel when there are other places in the world where terrible things are unfolding as well? Isn't it implicitly anti-Semitism that's motivating all the focus on what's going on in Gaza? At the very end, I think you said something different, which is it's actually because Sudan is so poor and maybe because it's so far south in Africa that we just don't pay any attention to it. Do I have you right on
Well,
that?
I don't know what the reason is. I don't know. What I'm asking is why does the world focused on the numbers of people killed in the Israeli Gaza war? And this is the worst and the most, and you keep hearing things like that. And the other parts of the world where millions are dying, either
So
from war or famine or both.
I'm not sure I can give you a complete answer to that question, Ann, but I'll take a stab at
If
it.
you can, that would be amazing.
Well, I'll take a stab at some of the factors, right? I mean, and so some of it has to do with the fact that what's happening in Sudan is a civil war as opposed to an international war, right? And that, when societies fall into anarchy, in a sense, it's a little harder when states fail, when armed parties within the society rise in conflict against each other. It's a little harder to assign clear-cut blame, right? This is an international war between groups of people who think of themselves in ethnic and racial and national terms as distinct, right? And so that makes it maybe a little easier to say this is not just a disaster, a catastrophe. This is something that actually the dividing lines are a little bit more clear cut, and that gives rise to maybe a little bit more clarity of judgment. Then the second thing I'll say, right? Um, the United States provides a great deal of arms and support to Israel. And so I think many people in this country feel implicated, maybe even complicit. And then you add, right, that institutions that have students at them are investing their endowments in funds that include the people making those arms that are doing the damage in Israel, right? And so the US government and other civil society institutions appear to be more complicit in this conflict, and therefore we have more domestic protest. And then you add, by the way, this issue has become a polarizing issue, like so many other issues. And it's become, I think, a pretext. I think it's quite obvious that it's a smokescreen for going after colleges and universities in order to bring them to heel by the current administration. But this is caught up in domestic politics in a way that what's happening in Sudan is not cut up. And then I'll add one more layer to my explanation, which is something sometimes called compassion fatigue, right? When the suffering in the world overwhelms you, and by the way, it's probably going to get worse, not better. I'm sorry to say. It's a natural instinct of self-protection because we are empathic creatures. And because being in a situation where focusing on suffering, where there's nothing constructive that you can do about it, is deeply exhausting and upsetting if you really let yourself feel the compassion. That in all of those regards, there's a natural tendency to just say, okay, this is too much. I can't pay attention to this and go about my life. Right. And so I think some people are choosing to focus on the area where they think they might have some leverage, they might have some agency, and Sudan just seems too far, too distant, too complex. It's not an excuse. It's not a good reason, right? To the extent that we're genuinely internationalist, cosmopolitan, humanitarian, right? Pick your description. Those refer to slightly different positions, but we should be deeply concerned when there is war and famine and suffering and civilian populations in the crosshairs wherever that occurs in the world. So I'm not trying to excuse it. I am trying to explain it, and I do think those layers help to explain it. Does that help, Anne? And not that it makes sense of it, but at least maybe it makes it make a little bit more sense.
Maybe a little bit more. Thank you.
You bet. Did I see somebody else with their hand up a moment ago? I thought I did. If not, I'm going to jump right back into it because there's plenty to discuss. And I'll just, as I'm getting the slides set back up again, note that one of the things that I do hear sometimes is this charge. Well, people are paying attention to Israel and Gaza because they don't like Israel, because they don't like the Jews, because they're anti-Semitic. And I have to say, right? So I teach on these campuses. At least in my experience, I don't think that that is an accurate perception of the people who are particularly focused on Israel. It is, of course, the case that there are many people, and some of them clearly are anti-Semitic, and some of them really do say hateful things. But that there are a lot of people, especially young people on college campuses in this country, who are focused on this from a genuine humanitarian perspective. Many of them are, in fact, Jewish, and I think there's a different degree of, or a different perception, perhaps, of complicity if a regime that claims to be a Jewish democracy and you yourself fit that identity, are Jewish, the sense that maybe you are, if you don't like what that regime is doing, you need to speak out to make it clear that you don't. Let's get into the details of what's happening. And I have two different ways I'm going to approach this. I'm going to look through the 20-point plan. And I'm not going to look at all 20 points because, frankly, we would be here for hours, despite the fact that it is vague, not right, trying to flesh out all the details, just trying to create a skeletal framework. Nevertheless, I think there's enough content here that we can't go into all of it. I want to start when you will see, I'll highlight a couple points from the first 10 that I think are really worth thinking about, and then spend a little bit of time thinking about the other 8 from a more schematic point of view, and then get into the second 10, where I'll concentrate on 4 or 5 of the points. So the first point, Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. I want to say 2 things about this, right? Opening, simple assertion in this 20-point peace plan. The first is, and I think it's important to ask this as we read each provision, who is the audience? Who needs to hear this for this peace plan to work? This is clearly addressed to Israel, right? And the idea that if this plan unfolds, they will not need to worry about aggression from Hamas ever again, or from some other organization that looks like Hamas and has the same aims as Hamas, Gaza will not be home to terrorist organizations that target their neighbors ever again. And so that's the force, that's the carrot, that's the promise, and in a sense it's saying to Israel, you can get what you want without war, without total victory, because we will create incentives, an infrastructure, forms of monitoring that will allow you to rest secure that the Palestinians in Gaza will never threaten you again. The second thing I want to say is, frankly, this would be like me standing up in front of my classroom and saying, all students will always do all of the reading and their homework and assignments on time and come to class awake and alert and undistracted and pay perfect attention to each other and me. And I can say that, of course, but I can't make it the case, right? I have to be met halfway by my students' willingness. And in order to do that, I don't just have to admonish and threaten them and, make it clear in the first week of the class when they're all bright and bushy tailed and ready to go, but I have to sustain their investment in what I'm teaching them throughout a 15-week semester. And similarly, you can't wave a flag and a wand and through fiat say, the Gazans will give up on terror, the Palestinians will not be violent. This is not something you can accomplish through external pressure and admonishment alone. It has to come from within. And so I do think one of the main forces of this 20-point plan, one of the main goals and the guiding logic is to create a situation in which the Palestinians of Gaza won't want to engage in radical terror and violence against their neighbors. And so then if you ask two questions, right? Why has Gaza been a threat? And what would be necessary for it not to be a threat? I think that the answer to the first question depends in large part on what Amnesty International and other international human rights organizations and observers have said, right? That Gaza has been, for much of the last 20 years, the largest open air prison in the world, right? And let me jump ahead for a moment. And I do have a number of different slides that are mainly in the background here, but I just want to look at this, right? This is the overall map, and this is more of a close-up map. These maps are older, but the idea, right, that Gaza and Israel share a border, right, that runs almost the whole length of Israel, that these are both very small societies, right? If you wanted a comparison, right, this total territory is smaller than Delaware, right? And if we add the West Bank, right, to the territory here, you can see, right, this is the potential territory for a future Palestinian state. And it is, a sizable, long border with Israel. And note also, right, that the population of Israel is about 10 million, right? And so fewer than the people who come to Manhattan every day. It's about 7 million Jews, 2 million Arabs. But then if you add that the population of the West Bank is 3 and Gaza is 2, you begin to see how important and yet difficult it is for these societies to live side by side. If, as I was starting to show you, Gaza, right, which has this long border with Israel, and then just the Mediterranean coast as its third border, a shorter border with Egypt with the Rafah Gate, right? If Gaza, right, doesn't have access to Israel or access to the Mediterranean, if the Rafah Gate is only intermittently open, it is completely isolated and cut off. And people who live in an open air prison, who have no real opportunity for agency over their lives or outlets for their ambition, are going to be prone to grievance, resentment, anger. It festers and they become ripe recruits for terrorist organizations, right? And in a sense, I think you want to say, if you have self-respect, if you are put in this situation, you will want to fight to get out of this situation, right? So, in a sense, if you want Gaza to be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone, you've got to give the people who live there some outlet for their agency, for their ambition, for their desires to have meaningful lives that involve not treating it as an open air prison. So that's the first proposition in this 20-point plan. I'll get into, right, well, let me do this first, actually, just to notice, and this is more of a schematic overview, right? Um, and so we are in the early phases of the hostage exchange, right? The preconditions was that both sides sign the broad agreement, the Israeli cabinet approve it, and then there's a 72-hour window. I think we're about 36 hours into it for the right Hamas held Israelis who are still alive to be returned to Israel. There's about 20 of them, and apparently this is likely to happen in the next roughly 36 hours. And please note, right, that it's become clear, and I certainly hope it won't be a sticking point in proceeding beyond this, that the 28 or so hostages who are now dead and buried in collapsed tunnels under rubble will be exhumed and returned. Um, but that is going to take longer than 72 hours. That there's just not the capacity to even locate them, let alone to carefully exhume them, that would be required. And so although the agreement says this is one of these places where if it's going to succeed, both sides are going to have to show some flexibility. The other most urgent aspect of this is getting aid to Gaza, right? So the broad agreement that has been signed includes the idea that there will be humanitarian aid, and then the aid has to start entering Gaza. The Rafah crossing has to reopen, and I want to be careful and clear about this, right? Anybody who has studied famine knows that once famine is advanced, and it is advanced in Gaza, that it's insufficient to simply provide food, right? People who are suffering from protracted starvation, their organs begin to fail, right? Cascading failure. And they need medical attention. You can't just give them food if their livers, their kidneys are not working, their digestive tract is constricted. You need to give them IVs and electrolytes and other forms of nutrients that will allow their body to start functioning again before they can actually have food. And so it's not just opening food corridors, it's allowing international medical teams to get on the ground and start delivering the aid that is required. The idea that then there will be a partial Israeli uh, withdrawal of troops. Again, there's been some progress on this. One of the things that's interesting is it says according to agreed to lines, and of course there were no agreed to lines. So right now Israel is doing this unilaterally. Hopefully, this is also something that the two sides can come to quick agreement on. But Gaza governance, disarmament, international security mission, a full Israeli withdrawal, reconstruction of the absolutely razed to the ground infrastructure of Gaza, right? There are apartments, schools, hospitals, homes, mosques, grocery stores, restaurants, cafes, all leveled, right? It all needs to be reconstructed. And in the same time, rebuilding, I shouldn't say rebuilding, creating an economic infrastructure for Gaza that actually allows the people of Gaza to have meaningful economic lives, to be able to support themselves, to not be dependent exclusively on international aid, to have outlets for their ambitions, their creativity, their agency. That is going to be essential in the rebuilding process. Rebuilding doesn't just include, right, building again what has been destroyed, but also building anew what Gaza was lacking. All right, so now jumping ahead to point number 9. Um, Again, please share your questions, thoughts with me whenever you have them. Gaza will be governed under the temporary transitional governance of a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian committee responsible for delivering the day to day running of public services and municipalities for the people in Gaza. Right? And I'll just ask you, half jokingly, how many technocratic, apolitical people do you know? Right? I think I know what this means, which is we don't want people entering the Palestinian Committee for reconstructing Gaza, whose chief aim is to overthrow or attack Israel. We want their focus to be elsewhere. But the idea that there are plenty of Palestinians who want to participate in this, I think, is absolutely clear in the Palestinian diaspora as well as in Gaza and in the West Bank. But, the idea that there's going to be some political screen, the mechanism of how these people are going to be identified, how they're going to be incorporated, what kind of democratic or political accountability will there be to the people whose right lives they're assisting to reconstruct. All of this is right left totally vague. Again, I think there is a little bit in this for both the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Israelis are getting a guarantee that these will not be people who want to focus on destroying Israel. The Palestinians are getting some control over their future, but boy, is the devil in the details, and the details are missing from this document. This committee will be made up of qualified Palestinians and international experts with oversight and supervision by a new international transitional body, the Board of Peace, which will be headed and chaired by President Donald J. Trump, with other members and heads of state to be announced, including former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Now, I want to say just a couple things about this, and I don't want to concentrate here today. But I do believe that Donald Trump gets some credit for having proposed this plan, for having twisted Benjamin Netanyahu's arm to get him to actually agree to this plan. But I also believe, right, Donald Trump gets some blame for having allowed over the last 9 months the situation in Gaza to deteriorate to the point that it has deteriorated. I also believe that the reason that Tony Blair is in this plan is because it appears that this is primarily Tony Blair's plan. And we know Donald Trump likes having his name on things irrespective of how much work he actually did to make the thing. And if his name being on this plan, if him being, right, the chair of the Board of Peace allows him to remain focused, bought in, to expend the capital to provide the aid necessary to make this work, all the better, right? It is, I think, still the case that the United States needs to be directly involved if this is going to have any success. And whether you like him or not, Donald Trump is the president of the United States for more than 3 more years. I'll continue. This body will set the framework and handle the funding for the redevelopment of Gaza until such time as the Palestinian Authority has completed its reform program as outlined in various proposals, including President Trump's peace plan in 2020 and the Saudi-French proposal, and can securely and effectively take back control of Gaza. Sorry, that's a mouthful. Give me a second. So, I think what is being asserted quite clearly here is that the Palestinian Authority will ultimately be the governing agency for both the West Bank and Gaza, right? And so the split in the Palestinian governance structures will come to an end, but that this will be a reformed Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority right now is deeply compromised by its right cooperation with Israel in the right face of ongoing settlements that are increasingly displacing Palestinians from the West Bank. And when I say displacing, right, burning their buildings, razing their fields, lighting right, the murdering, right, the neighboring populations, deliberately, right, creating settlements in a way that provoke conflict and lead to the undermining of the economic viability of Palestinian villages in the West Bank. So the Palestinian Authority needs reform. It needs reform so that it's less corrupt, so that it's more effective. It needs elections, right? Mahmoud Abbas is very old and been there for a very long time and has been unwilling to stand for election or give way to new leadership. And so this is, again, something that is going to happen um, indigenously. It's going to have to happen at the direction of and with the participation of the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza. And it will require much more peaceful conditions. And so let me say this very quickly, right? The idea that Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone that doesn't pose a threat to its neighbors, that it will ultimately be governed by the Palestinian Authority. This requires not only that the Palestinians have some hope, some economic opportunity and security in their lives, it clearly requires that the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli government stop supporting settlements that are designed, engineered to displace Palestinians from the remaining territory that they control in the West Bank. And I want to be as clear as possible. We know that members of the current coalition government in Israel call for a second Nakba, right, for the catastrophe of 1948 in the way in which the Palestinian and some revisionary history in Israel from Israeli Jews also tell the story, right, of a complicated history, but one in which Palestinians were forced from their homes or fled from their homes. The second Nakba is the idea that the Palestinians will be pushed out of the West Bank, out of Gaza. And this is an ongoing process in Gaza with the war, in the West Bank with the settlements, and it has to stop. And more than that, for this plan to succeed, it seems to me eventually Israel will have to remove many of the settlements that have been constructed over the last 20 years in the West Bank. And again, there are bitter pills in this plan for both sides. Benjamin Netanyahu is clearly opposed to some aspects of this, and yet for this plan to succeed, it will have to go ahead either under his leadership or under future alternative Israeli leadership. So we have more to cover. Let me try to get the 4 points from the second 10 right points in this 20-point peace plan that I think are really important to discuss. And obviously, world enough in time, we would discuss all of it, but let me start with point number 13. Hamas and other factions agree to not have any role in the governance of Gaza, directly, indirectly, or in any form. All military, terror, and offensive infrastructure, including tunnels and weapon production facilities, will be destroyed and not rebuilt. There will be a process of demilitarization of Gaza under the supervision of independent monitors, which will include placing weapons permanently beyond use through an agreed process of decommissioning and supported by internationally funded buyback and reintegration program, all verified by the independent monitors. And so again, this is kind of directly linked to point one. If Gaza is not going to be a threat to Israel, well, one of the things that has to be the case is that Israel is not going to be a threat to Gaza, right? You do not unilaterally disarm if you do not trust either that there's some security guarantee or that your neighbors are not going to take advantage of your disarmament to attack you, right? And when you have members of the government of Israel who say, we want a greater Israel, we want to return to the biblical borders of Israel, we want to, right, seize and control and eventually integrate or annex the West Bank and Gaza, it's very hard to imagine the Palestinians agreeing to completely disarm, right? But having said that, I skipped over one of the earlier provisions in which Hamas is allowed to disband, and the members of Hamas are given amnesty and given the opportunity to either stay in Gaza or leave for Iran or Jordan or wherever else they would like to go. And those are right bitter pills for Hamas, which essentially is being put out of business by this agreement, as well as for Israel, which is not getting to prosecute the people who attacked them on October 7th or caused great suffering to many families. This is right all complicated, but I do think that the idea that it's not just Hamas, that it's any other faction, all military terror and offensive infrastructure has to be dismantled, is a very big incentive for Israel to buy into this. Point 18. An interfaith dialogue process will be established based on the values of tolerance and peaceful coexistence to try and change mindsets and narratives of Palestinians and Israelis by emphasizing the benefits that can be derived from peace. And here again, I think we go all the way back to Shimon Peres, the idea of economic integration, that it has right managed to render the European powers much more cooperative with each other, right? The idea that you can now drive across Europe and not even stop at borders, right? Because it's one integrated territory, the European Union. Imagine that for this region. Imagine what a tremendous transformation that would be. How do you get there? And here the literature on mutual hatred, stereotypes, animosity is very clear. You need sustained contact. And while interfaith dialogue, right, is already happening, and please note, in some places very successful, it is also a self-selective process. Who wants to engage in interfaith dialogue? The people who don't want to have to hate each other, right? Who actually have a certain cautious, optimistic view that when I talk with the other side, when I listen to the other side, they will be respectful. We will humanize each other in each other's eyes, and this will commit to progress, to greater mutual recognition and understanding. The problem is that many people who most need to be reached, most need to have their hateful views of the other side transformed precisely because they're dug in, will not participate in interfaith dialogue. And the question of how it filters out into the broader society is one that many reconciliation processes throughout the world have wrestled with and often foundered on in these post-conflict environments. But having said that, I'll just say this very quickly again. If it is the case that Palestinians from Gaza are going into Israel on a daily basis, working side by side with the Israelis on construction projects, in service industries, etc. If it is the case that the Israelis and Palestinians are selling olive oil and cars, etc., to each other, if they are encountering each other, in other words, not just in the rarefied special environment of an interfaith dialogue process, but on a daily basis because it's part of the texture of their lives, that can break down stereotypes. So I do think the economic integration of Israel and a Gaza post reconstruction is going to be extraordinarily important and incredibly difficult to imagine the Israelis actually allowing the back and forth between Gaza and Israel that was routine 20 years ago. But 20 years ago, it occurred in a context of much greater trust, much less animosity. Point 19, and this I think is the most bitter pill for Benjamin Netanyahu and his government and supporters. While Gaza redevelopment advances and when the PA reform program is faithfully carried out, again, just tremendously wishful thinking here, but assume that that has happened, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood, which we recognize as the aspirations of the Palestinian people, right? And to be as clear as possible, that's one of the aspirations of the Palestinian people. Obviously, regaining control over what used to be called the Palestinian Mandate is an ambition of some Palestinian people, right? The right of return to go back to the homes that they lived in what is now Israel is an ambition of other Palestinian people. So to channel Palestinian ambition into a two-state solution involves, right, creating a credible opportunity to move forward into a decent future in a Palestinian state rather than focusing on the dispossession of 48 or from subsequent wars. And by the way, of course, dismantling the settlers' settlements in the West Bank so that this can become the Palestinians' sovereign homeland. And again, right, very difficult for Israelis and in particular for Benjamin Netanyahu to actually accept this, but there are bitter pills on both sides. Final provision that I'll call your attention to briefly. The United States will establish a dialogue between Israel and Israel and the Palestinians to agree on a political horizon for peaceful and prosperous coexistence. And I hope it's clear. I just wanted to call your attention. 18 is really a civil society idea. These are two peoples, and the millions of people on both sides need to have enough sustained interaction with each other that they stop stereotyping and hating each other. And on the other hand, the call in point 20 is more at the level of governments than civil society. Israel and Palestine need to start working together for a shared future. Now, I think I'd better leave it there. I imagine there must be a lot you want to discuss. I have a lot more too, but I do want there to be the opportunity for us to begin this discussion. John, I can see your hand is already up. Go ahead. Nice to see you, John.
Nice to see you. And I really appreciate very much your going through this agreement in detail. Like probably a lot of us, I've managed to skip over the real content of it because the achieving it has been so dramatic. But it's interesting to me that although I would say in the couple of years or whenever you've been doing this, that the great bulk of our attention has been paid to Donald Trump, that he only gets mentioned in passing in this lecture. And in contrast to that, I would quote Peggy Noonan's terrific column this morning in the Wall Street Journal, which she says quite a lot of interesting stuff, but she says, I want to pay tribute to the wonderful, creative insanity Donald Trump can display on the international front, that it's only his imagination. You remember the Riviera of the Mediterranean comment and whatever that just really brought out a whole new dimension to anybody's thinking about Gaza. And I think he probably deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for this, even if he didn't get it this time around. So I just think that's worth mentioning, and I'll send the Peggy Noonan column around to the
Group.
to all of us in case they don't see the Wall Street Journal.
Please include me, John. I would
I sure
appreciate
will.
it. And I have to say two things, and they kind of contradict each other. On the one hand, clearly Donald Trump is an outside the box thinker in a whole bunch of ways, including in international relations. And boy, we have been stuck on this conflict for a very long time. And so I do think there is this tendency for the foreign policy establishment to just get into these ruts of their routine approaches, and that Donald Trump does get some credit for this. I also want to say on the other side, right? Please note that it appears that this is maybe Tony Blair's plan that Donald Trump has adopted, right? And that doesn't mean that he doesn't get credit for taking the risk of adopting it. And by the way, I do think he clearly is motivated by the idea that he wants a Nobel Peace Prize, right? And please note, right, Barack Obama got one. And I think part of the motive force in the Trump presidency is to say anything that Barack Obama did, I will do better, right? But having said that, I then want to add, right, that I do think that for the last 9 months, the Israelis have felt an absence of constraint in the way in which they've conducted the war. And that has been in part because Donald Trump appears to be so supportive of the Netanyahu government. And that in the last 9 months, and I won't fabricate numbers for us, but I'm sure thousands or tens of thousands of Palestinians have died, countless more have suffered. And so the idea, and we dealt with this with Yasser Arafat a long time ago. Do you give the peace prize to the person who signed the peace deal, even though in their recent past they were warriors, right? Or they were contributing to the suffering. And so this is an ambiguous case. Obviously, he didn't get it this year. Will he be right on the rostrum next year receiving that prize? I'm not sure. But certainly, I do think give credit where credit is due. And this is a hopeful moment, and Donald Trump has helped to get both sides to the place where they are no longer killing each other, and hopefully some aid will get through. So point taken in that regard for sure, John. Thank you for that. Who else has something to add to this conversation today? Yeah, go ahead, Bridget.
This is very shallow, but
Oh, I'm sorry.
this is very shallow, but
I'm
I'm thinking I maybe having been received by uh, King Charles and the royals, that had something to do with it, that the Brits or waving a handkerchief and saying, we'll invite you again. You'll be on the grand stage, and in return, uh, just help us with this plan.
Yeah, so I think I'm not going to speculate about where this comes from, right? I suppose at some point we will have the history that will tell us, right, whether or not the second royal visit it was one place where the road was prepared to get Donald Trump to accept this plan. Or did it come through the State Department or other back channels? I'm just not sure about that. I haven't got information about that, but it's an interesting suggestion. Jeanette, go ahead. You're still muted. There you go.
My thought about the Nobel Prize is if a year from now Trump has really been doing what needs to be done to make this work, then he does deserve the prize. But knowing Trump, he also may go off into something else and not be interested in keeping it going. So it seems to me that that it very much is a matter of what happens next in this.
And so let me stick with this for a second. I didn't actually anticipate discussing this as much as we are today. But you think about Yasser Arafat, you think about Nelson Mandela, people who have backgrounds as freedom fighters, but also as terrorists, right? Who eventually turn the corner into more of a peaceful position, and then maybe they're eligible for the award, and that you do want to award people who are able to have an epiphany and an identity change and become peacemakers after they were right fighters and terrorists. But then let me add very quickly, how much does it matter for the committees, right? And it's the Nobel Committee that's going to make up their minds about this, for their considerations that Donald Trump is sending troops into American cities, right? Or that Donald Trump, in various ways, seems to be fomenting conflict in our society, right? And there's a front page story in the New York Times today about the split screen ambivalence of Donald Trump, who's a peacemaker abroad and a polarizer who wants to send troops into the cities of the mayors he disagrees with, or the cities that just represent an alternative view of America, a diverse, prosperous, peaceful view where immigrants are welcomed as opposed to vilified. And is that not the profile of someone who is ultimately all around a peacemaker, even if they were a belligerent in the past? Ruth, I can see you have your hand up. You want to respond to that point, right? You're still muted, Ruth.
No, I wasn't. I wanted to thank you for going over each of those points. And I'm really impressed by the clarity and simplicity of the language. I mean, you really can't, it's not fuzzy. It's not, oh, maybe they mean this and maybe they mean that. And I think whoever wrote it, Tony Blair or whoever, I think should really get a lot of credit because that's not easy to do in such a complicated situation.
Yeah, no, I suspect, and it's not just because program is spelled with two M's and an E, right? Which seems to reveal something, right? But the background understanding of the conflict, and also the fundamental right pivot. We're not going to focus on what happened in 1948 or 1972 or 2023. We're going to focus on the next 25 years and creating a future that allows the Palestinian people and the Israeli people to forget the atrocities of the past. And so, there's various things that have been written about this. Ernst Renan has written about the St. Valentine's Day massacre in France, right? And we don't think very much about that anymore. Why? Well, because Protestants and Catholics seem to get along in France. And one of the ways they manage to get along is because they forget some of the worst things that they did to each other, because dwelling on them makes it really hard to get along, right? And that right effort to change the narrative. And boy, is part of the difficulty here that there are these competing narratives, right? Whereas Israel sees the founding of Israel as right the greatest moment, the right Palestinians continue to refer to it as the catastrophe. And then we could go forward, right? What happened in Oslo? Who's to blame for the peace accords falling apart, right? Et cetera, and so on, right? There's so many recriminations. And so I do think the idea that if not only there is a focus on the future, but the future actually looks like something both sides desire, and it is mutually beneficial, that this is an alternative path out of this is really important. So yeah, thank you, Ruth. I agree that this plan is original. Coming back to what John is saying, it breaks some of the impasse that has been right bedeviling these peoples and societies for so long, and that it pivots in a way into a more hopeful scenario. That this is promising. This is hopeful. Thank you, Ruth. Barbara, I see you've got your hand up, and then John, I'll come to you.
It strikes me that trying to draw a parallel between Trump and then Arafat, Mandela, and such, the difference is Trump is definitely a catalyst from without, whereas they were committed catalysts from within. And what seems to be missing so far on this is the leader from within of the Palestinians, where we've got them held up still in, and Netanyahu, who may agree to this, but he's not leading the charge. He's not doing what Mandela did and say, I forgive you for what you did. Let's go forward. And it's going to take a really long time.
Yeah. And Barbara, I started, and I'll just say again, that neither side appears to be coming to this process with genuine enthusiasm for reconciliation, right? What happened to Nelson Mandela in jail, right? A genuine kind of deep moral, ethical, religious conversion into a totally different political aim, right? I don't think that it characterizes either side right now. As you point out, the Palestinians don't really have effective leadership right now. And so who speaks for them? And on the other side, Benjamin Netanyahu dominates Israeli politics. I suspect eventually, well, by a year from now, he will have to stand for re-election, but I suspect it'll come sooner than that. And I suspect he will be reelected. Right now, he is quite unpopular, but if this war really does end, if the hostages really do come home, I suspect it's going to bolster his popularity. And then, by the way, he gets responsibility for having significantly degraded Hezbollah, for essentially having eliminated Hamas, for substantial damage to Iran. And that those are things that many Israelis will credit him for in the coming election. John, go ahead. Oh, Barbara, did you want to follow up?
I was just going to say, we seem to forget or discount the role of the Zionists from 1900 to 1948 that were not a single person, but multiple people in positions of leadership within the Jewish diaspora and community that were able to lobby and set the stage. The fact that it ran off the rails with Netanyahu is a different story. I don't want to look backward, but that without that, there would be no Israel.
Of course.
The British wouldn't have just said, "Oh, hey guys, let's take you down there and give you a country."
Yeah, and so two things, right? To note, it's not just the Zionists in the diaspora; it's the Zionists who were settling
No, that's what I meant.
They hoped would eventually become the Jewish homeland of Israel. And
No, I meant
would also add, I just think it's really important to pay attention to how internally diverse the first couple generations of Zionists were, right? And so the hotly contested question of whether Israel should be a Jewish democracy or not, with the emphasis on Jewish, right? Should this be primarily a Jewish state, or should it be a state in which the Jews and the Palestinians, Arabs, live, right, side by side as equal citizens? And although that, right, debate has been, at least for now, resolved in favor of one side, an accurate historical understanding of how diverse these views were, I think, is really important as well. John, thank you for waiting. What is it you wanted to say?
I just wanted to add that this is a really big deal. There's a lot of credit to go around, and there's no problem. We don't have to really decide, did the Brits deserve more than Donald Trump or anybody else? I think we can be happy about it. But Trump's role is certainly important and deserves recognition. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And boy, I have to completely agree. This is a big deal, right? This was a slowly unfolding humanitarian catastrophe, and going back to, right, Barbara's early point, right? I think many of us were petrified at the prospect of what was going to happen if this conflict went on for another 6 months, right? And thank God that we're at a point now where it appears there is at least a narrow, fraught pathway forward in the direction of a more stable, peaceful solution to this conflict. All right, everyone. I think that's a good place to end today. Thank you for the respectful and insightful way in which you approached today's discussion. I know this isn't easy for any of us. Good as always to be with you and to have the opportunity to talk this stuff through with you. Be well. See everybody next week. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.